Hi class, welcome to this lecture on the Italian Renaissance. I wanted to start with this image. This is actually an image that I took in 2008 when I was studying in Italy, in Florence, Italy. And we're going to be focusing our attention today on Florence, Italy itself, because this is really where we have the birth of the Italian Renaissance, where we have all these amazing artists coming out of Florence at this time, and we also have the rise of very important patrons, namely the Medici family, who are basically ruling the city at this time and giving a lot of their money to local arts. So I wanted to start here. I'll draw your attention to this important dome. This is the Duomo. It's a central dome downtown in the city, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, a very important architect and artist, who also was responsible for inventing a technique that was very important to the Italian Renaissance called linear perspective. So that's one of the things we'll focus on today. Here we also have another important dome. This is the Medici Chapel. This is where one of the most important patrons of the Italian Renaissance, Lorenzo de' Medici, is buried. But we won't go too close into all these themes. But so this won't be a complete encompassing lecture of the whole chapter, but rather we'll really touch on a few key themes such as humanism and linear perspective. These two important kind of concepts that come up in the 15th century in Italy. But first I wanted to start by looking at what came before the Renaissance. So before the Renaissance, we have a period we call medieval, the medieval period or the Middle Ages. So what about it? It's very, very different than what we end up seeing in the Renaissance period. So if you look at this painting, this is a detail of a giant fresco that would have been painted on the walls in a nearby city, Siena, which is close to Florence. And if you look here, what do you see? Does it seem like this city is laid out in a realistic fashion? You might say no. And so if we look around, all these buildings are kind of scattered. They're overlapping one another in unrealistic ways. Their renderings of the human body are not quite right. Proportions are slightly off. The way that the streets move, the recession of space is not really naturally depicted. So here we do have, an interest in representing the city, but we have artists who are not quite exactly sure how to represent real spaces like this in the most desirable fashion. So we'll see in the Italian Renaissance where artists begin to use linear perspective to really understand how to represent recessions in space. The same goes, so here we go, this is actually shows you a big difference between the medieval period, the Middle Ages, and the art that starts to come out in Italy during the Renaissance. And we'll talk about linear perspective more in detail in just a second, but I wanted to show you these key differences, right? So here we actually have the use of linear perspective and aerial perspective. So these are two things that do come up in your book, so make sure that you note that. But look at how much more realistically the space is depicted and how the recession of space actually looks natural, much more natural than what we have up here that would have been taking place in the 13th and 14th centuries. The same goes for sculpture during this period. So here we have at right David. This is a super important sculpture. Many of you have probably seen it. It's located in Florence. It's by Michelangelo, and a very important high Renaissance artist. And look at the depiction of the human body. It's very natural, naturalistically rendered. Not that any of us look like this at all, but you can see that there's much more attention paid to the human body than these sculptures over on the left, which are very typical of representations of the human figure during the medieval and Middle Ages period, which came just before the Renaissance. So let's talk about what's actually happening here. The Black Death otherwise known as the Plague, arrived in Sicily around 1348, and it quickly spread north. So 75 to 200 million people were affected, and it was kind of a silent killer. It was carried by rats, so really no population was safe because rats had control of the sewers, and basically, you couldn't escape the Black Death. So this was terrifying, um, tremendously terrifying for many in Western Europe. And so this was very hard for people, especially, in the context of Western Europe, which was very religious at this time. We have the mass death of so many people because of the Black Plague, that this really kind of set a lot of people's religious thoughts into kind of turmoil. So people weren't sure how, the God that they worshipped would let this happen. So this is a very strange and very difficult time in Western Europe. Following this, feudal rule gave way to centralized form of government. So because of this, we have the kind of growth of what we call city-states, especially in the Italian continent. An influx of workers were then actually led to come to cities because there were more manufacturing jobs. There's also a lot more trade going on, and this also contributed to the growth of the intellectual class. So we have people coming to cities and educating themselves, valuing education, and so from here we also have the rise of patronage in Western Europe. So between 1400 and 1500, Western Europe basically experienced what we call a rebirth or renaissance of classical values. So Renaissance literally does mean the rebirth. And that's because artists and theorists, philosophers at this time were looking to the classical past. So when we talk about the classical past, we can actually think back to two different spaces, Greece and Rome. So these were two ancient civilizations that are completely known for having been the most well-maintained and best ruled civilizations of the ancient world. And so artists at this time were interested in that classical past and all the values of the classical past, and they wanted those values to be reborn in their artwork, in their philosophies, in the writings that came out at this time. So this is really where the Renaissance comes from, especially after a time in history when we have mass death. And so people are kind of coming over this very difficult time and wanting to change things. And so here we have a renewed interest in change by looking to the classical past. So as I said, the Renaissance was a time of renewal. Again, rebirth is the key word here, as Europe was recovering from the Dark Ages and the plague. So because of there's an interest in the secular world. So there's a move away from life in the church, and there's much more focus on the material objects in one's life, and much more focus on enjoying life itself. So rather than spending all your time worshiping your God, maintaining life around the church, one would be more interested in the material objects in life and enjoying life, recreational activities, and so forth. So this was very big during the Italian Renaissance. Also at this time we have an increase in trade, so especially with the Middle East. This means much more profit for city-states, especially in Italy. So you can see here a map of the trade that increased at this time. So more patrons were sponsoring works because there was much more money in the cities. And you didn't have to be a ruler to patron works, you just had to have money. And so a lot more people in cities like Florence, Rome, Naples, Venice had more money. And so important bakers, important traders were becoming important patrons for the city. And one of these very important families was the Medici family. They were centered in Florence, Italy. They were highly influential during the early Renaissance, and they essentially controlled banking in Florence. So here we have a portrait of Lorenzo de' Medici, one of the most famous Medici patrons. He actually studied Neoplatonic thought, which argued that contemporary or contemplating beauty would transform love into in a corrupt soul to spiritual love. So he's all about aesthetics and the notion that to contemplate something that is beautiful would contribute to kind of saving one's soul in regards to love, right? Loving others. So he was obsessed with imagery, and he became quite a patron of the arts in Renaissance Italy, and he's responsible for contributing much to the art world and sponsoring artists like Sandro Botticelli and Michelangelo, who we've looked at just a tiny bit already today in this lecture. So these patrons were really important. For the first time, we have artists getting paid fairly well for what they're doing. Artists are finally able to make ends meet and raise a family as artists, being an artist, as being your career. So this is really important because before this, we really didn't have artists making names for themselves. But here we have key artists who are making a name for themselves, who are able to support their families and contribute back to the local economy just by being artists. So this is kind of a big deal at this time. The other key concept that I wanted to bring up with the Italian Renaissance was the term humanism. Humanism was a belief in the unique value of every person. It was conceived in the 1330s, but it really didn't become a common belief until the rise of the Italian Renaissance. So it became very key to Italian Renaissance philosophy. It basically celebrated the individual. So rather than thinking of celebrating God in one's life, basically people were gods, right? It's all about celebrating one's self and the accomplishments of man as just as amazing as the accomplishments of God. So this stimulated the philosophy of secularism, the appreciation of worldly pleasures, and above all, intensified the assertion of personal independence and individual expression. This also stimulated the study of Greek and Roman literature and culture. So we talked about Greek and Roman cultures as being kind of the classical cultures. Again, this is something that Renaissance theorists, rulers, artists looked, of course, straight back to Greek and Roman cultures for inspiration. And this also helped to support because it was supported by wealthy patrons. So wealthy patrons such as the Medicis and others supported humanism as a belief system, and they believed in it themselves. And so for this reason, we had the people becoming more interested in individualism. And how do we see this happening in the city? Well, for instance, we have the building of important palazzos. So these are public spaces where people can meet and talk and debate. And we have public spaces for art as well. So actually here we have an open air loggia, is this what this would be called in Italian. It's an open air kind of space for these amazing, beautiful sculptures. And then if you move over here, you see this building here, and I've incorporated a picture right here of it. This is the Uffizi Gallery. So important galleries were also opened at this time, including the Uffizi, which is actually now, today, holds the largest collection of Italian Renaissance art, perhaps in the world. So these amazing collections were put together basically by people with lots of money, and now they're public. And so now we have this amazing history that we can access very easily if we go to Italy. So what's happening in terms of art? Well, at this time, this was the first time that we started seeing life-size nude sculptures coming back, and this was since antiquity. So since the classical past. So here we have Donatello's David, and here he's rendered in contrapposto. This is a classical pose that was basically invented by Polyclitus, a Greek mathematician and philosopher who was known for creating this amazing pose where the body looks for once relaxed. So he's actually leaning on one leg, bending one knee, bending one side of his body. He's in a position of relaxation. And this is the most naturalistic depiction of the human body that we have within the classical world, where everything before this was actually quite rigid. So let's actually look back to the classical world. So here's Polyclitus's Doryphorus, which I'm referring to. This is a classical piece from 450 before the Common Era, so way, way, way before the two Davids that I'm going to talk about in a second. But here we have the initial kind of invention of contrapposto, this relaxed kind of leaning onto one leg, tilting of the hips, right? Bending of one elbow, very relaxed posture, because this is how we typically stand, right? We don't stand with both legs straight and both arms straight. And so artists during the Renaissance recaptured contrapposto, but also became increasingly interested in the human body as a beautiful specimen. So because there's this turn away from the church, of course, there was still quite an emphasis on the church at this time, but people who followed humanism tended to work more towards secularism and thought much more about the impact of humans than the impact of God in one's life. And so they thought that the human body was the most amazing specimen, right? And so here we have two Davids. This one seems to look down almost in adoration of himself. And then here you have the perfected body looking straight to the classical past where we see Doryphorus. There's also an increased interest at this time in emotion. And we see this not only in the North. I think the last lecture I had, we actually spoke about the deposition, where we see a real interest in emotion and bringing classical figures from the Bible to life by making them emotional, rendering them as humans, not just as gods, right? Not just as these figures that are untouchable. And the same goes at this time for Adam and Eve, who somehow seem untouchable in the Bible. But here we have artists showing that their humility, their crying as they exit the Garden of Eden. And Florence becomes an important place because we have all these important artists living and coming out of there. So we have Leonardo, Da Vinci, you all know Da Vinci, we have Michelangelo, and we have Raphael, all living here at the same time, cultivating this kind of artistic environment. So now I wanted to look for a moment at the dome itself and look specifically out in front of it where we'll see the baptistry. This is the baptistry, and this is the building which inspired Filippo Brunelleschi to create his technique for linear perspective. So I wanted to show a quick video, just a second here. Alright, so let's watch this quick video about Brunelleschi's experiment and the invention of linear perspective by using that baptistry.
According to Filippo Brunelleschi's biographer, he stood just inside the main doors of the Cathedral of Florence when he conducted his first perspectival experiment. And that's where we're standing right now.
We're very close to it. Brunelleschi's experiment demonstrated that linear perspective could produce an incredibly realistic illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface.
So this notion that we can actually develop a system that would be relatively easy to follow, but highly accurate, that could translate the volumetric world that we move through through time onto a frozen two-dimensional surface is really an extraordinary achievement. There's some discussion among scholars as to whether or not there was linear perspective in the ancient world, but if there was, it was lost. And linear perspective was created, at least for us, in the modern world by Brunelleschi in the 15th century, around 1420.
Right, and so some people say that Brunelleschi rediscovered linear perspective in case the ancient Greeks and Romans had had it before him.
Brunelleschi had gone to Rome and had studied antiquity, and some have hypothesized that he developed the basis for linear perspective in an attempt to be able to accurately portray the buildings that he was looking at, that he was sketching, that he was drawing.
It's certainly something that artists beginning really in the 1300s were creating forms. They were creating human figures that were three-dimensional by using modeling and making the figures bulky and monumental. Then you had the challenge of putting those figures within a believable space. Giotto and Duccio had kind of approximated that space and began to create a kind of earthly setting for their figures, but had not achieved perfect illusion of space for their figures to inhabit.
As the culture becomes increasingly analytical, mathematical, it's a trade-based culture. This is a culture that in some ways may have demanded of its artists a kind of precision, a kind of mathematical accuracy in its representation. And Brunelleschi delivers that. So what does he do?
Brunelleschi creates a perspectively accurate image of the baptistry and its surround.
Right. So Brunelleschi develops a system with just a few essential elements, and through these elements is able to construct accurate scientific one-point perspective. They include a vanishing point, which is at the viewer's horizon line, as well as a series of orthogonals or illusionistically receding diagonals. What Brunelleschi then does is he paints or draws an image of the baptistry with linear perspective and puts a small hole in the center of it. He takes that small drawing or painting, puts a handle on it, and holds it in front of his face, but facing away from him. He then takes a mirror and holds it in back of that. Now remember, his painting has a small hole in it, so he can see through it straight to the vanishing point.
So he's holding the mirror at arm's length, and the actual painting with the hole in it right in front of him for his eye to look through.
Right. So you can see the painting's reflection in the mirror, and if he pulls the mirror away, you can see the actual baptistry. And he can bring the mirror back to see the painting, move the mirror away to see the actual baptistry, and see if, in fact, those lines are well coordinated. And it was a very convincing experiment.
What Brunelleschi saw in the reflection of the painting looked exactly like the reality that was in front of him.
This would have the most profound effect on the history of Western art. Virtually every painting in the Western tradition after the 15th century is responding to linear perspective, either adopting it or very consciously rejecting it for some reason.
And within a couple of decades after Brunelleschi's discovery, Alberti, the brilliant architect and theoretician, writes a book called On Painting, in which he codifies Brunelleschi's discovery and creates a manual for artists of how to use linear perspective and how to make great paintings.
All right, so here we do have this amazing system, as was so nicely laid out for you in the video, where we finally have a geometric linear perspective that's created by Brunelleschi using the dome, or using the baptistry out in front of the dome. So we have artists who can finally use this. It's almost a mathematical equation, right? The use of these orthogonals, lines you can find within the painting that draw your eye back in space to a vanishing point. And so here we have all these lines draw us back. The vanishing point is conveniently right here at this, on the horizon line at the center of this domed architectural building here at the door. And so artists are using that to really allow us to get a naturalized understanding in their paintings of real space. But what's happening before this? So here's what's going on before this. This is in the 1300s. We have artists who are trying to work with perspective and trying to use something like linear perspective, but clearly it's not working. So look, all sorts of orthogonals are outlined here, and these lines I've drawn over the painting, but none of them actually come to a centralized vanishing point. So they all go in different places. And of course, this is not ideal, and this is really not very naturalistic in terms of representing the recession of space. But artists are really using it to perfect their work after Brunelleschi perfects it. In the 15th century, as you see here, The Last Supper. This is one of those very important works that you all have probably seen before, but we have a beautiful use of orthogonals, right? You can find these lines throughout the piece, all coming down, all the slabs in the ceiling come down perfectly, as you can see, right down to Christ's head. And so here the vanishing point is not only at Christ's head, the most important part of the painting, but it's also at the vanishing point out the windows on the horizon. Okay, so we'll stop there for today. I don't want to make this lecture go too long, but that's all I have for today. Just a couple key themes that came out in this chapter. Please let me know if you have any questions. Go ahead and feel free to email me. I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you again next week.